Imagine a father, a man whose world is shattered not by a sudden accident, but by the slow, creeping horror of learning what was done to his son. His life, once a predictable rhythm of work and family, is fractured beyond repair. For days, he is silent. He waits. He plans. And then, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of an airport, under the unblinking eye of a television camera, he delivers his own verdict with a single pull of the trigger. Was this murder? Or was this a father becoming justice itself? Today, I will tell you the story of Gary Plauché. In this true event where justice, rage, and helplessness intertwine, prepare to question everything you believe about right and wrong. This is a story that unfolds not in the hallowed halls of a courthouse, but in the heart of a father pushed beyond the edge. Sometimes the greatest storms are hidden within the most ordinary of lives. And sometimes people like Gary decide to enact their own justice. The question is, what would you have done? Gary Plauché was a product of the humid, slow-moving culture of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was an ordinary man, forged in the blue-collar ethic of the American South. Life for Gary wasn't about grand ambitions. It was about the tangible, honorable duties of a working man. He was an air conditioning and heating technician, a job that required skilled, honest hands and the dependable nature qualities that defined him as a person. He married young, as was common, and soon found himself the father of 4 children. In this role, he found his truest identity. He was a dedicated father, a man who found profound meaning in providing for his family, in the small rituals of homework help, weekend fishing trips, and the comforting noise of a full house. His life was built not on wealth or status, but on a foundation of responsibility and a deep, abiding love for his children. However, the foundations of his own life proved less stable than the ones he tried to build for his family. Over time, his marriage frayed, the youthful connection eroded by the quiet pressures of life until it finally broke. The divorce was a painful schism, cleaving his daily life in two. But while the partnership with his wife ended, his role as a father did not. He fought to remain a constant, steady presence in his children's lives. Weekends became sacred, his time to reconnect, to be the fun parent, the confidant, the unwavering anchor in the shifting tides of their new family structure. He knew he now had to be more than just a father. He had to be their bedrock of all. His children, it was his youngest son, Jody, who occupied the most tender space in his heart. Jody was a sensitive boy, thoughtful and somewhat introverted, with a gentle nature that could sometimes be mistaken for fragility. He was a good, hard-working kid, but he struggled with the boisterous confidence that seemed to come so easily to other boys his age. For Gary, Jody was more than just his youngest son. He was the last, most tangible link to the intact family. Life he had lost, a bright spark he felt a fierce, primal need to protect. Jody's quiet nature presented some challenges at school. He was shy, making it difficult for him to make friends easily. To help build his confidence, channel his energy, and teach him a sense of discipline and self-worth, his mother decided to enroll him in a local karate dojo. It seemed like the perfect solution. For his mother, it was a path to discipline. For his father, it was a way for his son to feel stronger in the world, to learn to stand tall. For Jody, the dojo was a place of hope, a new world of gi-ice, colored belts, and structured respect. But neither Gary nor his ex-wife could ever have predicted that within the seemingly safe walls of that karate studio, a quiet predator was waiting, and that their son's life was about to be shattered. The instructor who took a special interest in Jody was a young man named Jeff Doucette. At 25, Doucette was a charismatic figure, a black belt whose calm demeanor, ever-present smile, and patient approach with children quickly earned him the trust of both his students and their parents. He seemed to be the ideal role model, disciplined, encouraging, and kind. He made the children feel seen and capable. But this trust, so freely given, was a tool that Doucette would expertly sharpen into a weapon. Over time, Doucette's interest in Jody began to cross a line from mentorship into something more focused, more insidious. He started singling Jody out. For extra praise, he offered to give him private lessons. Soon, he was taking Jody on outings outside of class, to the movies, to amusement parks for ice cream. He was spending more time with Jody than some family members did. At first, no one suspected anything was amiss. It was the early 1980s, a time of greater innocence, or perhaps greater naivete, about the nature of such dangers. Jody's mother saw Doucette's attention as a form of positive male mentorship, a big brother figure for her son. Gary, observing from a distance during his weekend visits, didn't know Doucette well, but seeing his son seem happy and more confident was enough to soothe his paternal concerns. He was unaware that behind this facade of kindness, a dark and manipulative scenario was being meticulously written. Jeff Doucette's goal was not just to teach. It was to groom, to isolate, and to establish absolute control. And tragically, he was succeeding. The year was 1984. The grooming process, a slow and methodical campaign of manipulation, had been underway for months. Jeff Doucette had successfully positioned himself as Jody's most trusted confidant, a figure of authority and affection who held more sway than his own parents. The final terrifying phase of his plan was set in motion on what began as an ordinary day. Jody had attended his karate practice. He was supposed to be at a bus stop, waiting for his ride home. But he never arrived when Jody didn't return home. At the expected time, his mother's initial annoyance slowly curdled into concern. She called a few of his friends' houses. No one had seen him. The concern began to sharpen into a knife edge of fear. She drove to Jeff Doucette's home, thinking perhaps he had taken Jody there after class, but there was no sign of them. As the hours stretched into a long, dark night, the terrible reality began to dawn. Jody was missing. The news hit Gary Plauché like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and the strength from his legs. The world, which had already felt unsteady since his divorce, now tilted into a horrifying, surreal nightmare. He joined the frantic search, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and prayer. He was no longer just a father. He was a man consumed by a singular, primal terror. Where was his son? Was he alive? Was he hurt? Was he scared? The not knowing was a form of torture more exquisite than any physical pain. The days that followed were a blur of police stations, frantic phone calls, and sleepless nights. The family was in pieces. Police launched a full-scale investigation, and the story of the missing 11-year-old boy became a local and then a national news story. Jody's school picture, his shy, hopeful smile frozen in time, was broadcast on television screens across the country. Radio announcers read his description. Volunteers, strangers moved by the family's plight, fanned out to search parks, woods, and abandoned areas. For Gary, every moment was an exercise in controlled agony. He had to remain strong for his other children, yet inside, he was disintegrating. What Gary and the police didn't know was that this wasn't a local disappearance. Jeff Doucette had abducted Jody and fled the state. He drove with the boy across the country, a horrifying road trip into darkness. They ended up in a cheap, anonymous motel in California. For days, in that sterile, lonely room, Doucette subjected Jody to unspeakable psychological and sexual abuse. He stripped Jody of his innocence, his security, and his childhood, leaving behind a deep psychic wound that would never fully heal. Jody was a prisoner, isolated from everyone he knew and loved, trapped with the very person he had been taught to trust and admire. The breakthrough in the case came from a televised plea. A national news program aired a segment on Jody's disappearance, and a tip came in. Someone recognized Jody from a motel in California. The information was relayed to local law enforcement, and police descended on the motel room. They found Jeff Doucette there with Jody. Doucette was arrested without a major incident, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. And Jody, physically, was found. He was thinner, his eyes were hollow and distant, but he was alive. The phone call informing Gary that his son had been found was a moment of overwhelming, explosive relief, a release of pressure so intense it brought him to his knees. But this relief was immediately followed by a cold, sickening dread as the details of what had happened began to emerge. When Jody was finally returned to Louisiana, the reunion was a bittersweet agony. Gary held his son, but the boy in his arms was not the same one who had left. The light in his eyes had been dimmed. He was withdrawn, haunted, and profoundly traumatized. Gary saw the irreversible darkness that had been forced upon his child, the carefree innocence that had been stolen and could never be returned. He listened as Jody, in halting, terrified whispers, began to recount the nightmare he had endured. In that moment, as he held his broken child, something inside Gary Plauché snapped. The grief, the fear, and the helplessness that had been tormenting him for days began to cool and harden into something else entirely. A cold, unyielding, and absolute rage. The system would now take its course. Doucette was in custody. A trial would follow. But as Gary looked at his son's shattered spirit, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that no court, no judge, no jury could ever deliver the justice his son truly deserved. The system had failed to protect Jody, and in Gary's mind, a new, terrible conviction began to form. If the system wouldn't deliver true justice, he would. In the weeks following Jody's rescue, Gary Plauché existed in a state of suspended animation. On the surface, he was a relieved father, going through the motions of supporting his son through therapy and police interviews. But beneath the surface, a silent, methodical storm was gathering. The rage he felt was not a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, patient fury that he nurtured in the quiet hours of the night. He listened as the legal process began to unfold. Jeff Doucette was being held in California, awaiting extradition back to Louisiana to face charges of aggravated kidnapping and molestation. Gary heard the legal experts talk about trials, plea bargains, and sentencing guidelines. He heard them talk about a justice system that, in his eyes, was designed to process criminals, not to avenge victims. The thought of Doucette sitting in a courtroom, perhaps showing a feigned remorse to a sympathetic jury, the possibility of him receiving a sentence that Gary felt could never match the lifelong sentence of trauma imposed on his son, it was all unbearable. He began to plan. It was not a grand, complicated scheme. It was the simple, brutal calculus of a man who had been pushed past his limit. He knew that Doucette would have to be transported back to Baton Rouge, and he knew that would likely happen via the local airport. He acquired a .38 caliber revolver, a small, easily concealable weapon. He learned the flight schedules. He staked out the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, familiarizing himself with its layout, its exits, and its public spaces. He was no longer just an air conditioning technician. He was a hunter, and his prey was the man who had destroyed his son's childhood. On the evening of Friday, March 16, 1984, the moment arrived. Gary got word that Doucette was on a flight scheduled to land that night. He drove to the airport, the cold, heavy weight of the revolver a stark reality against his body. He was disguised, but not elaborately. He wore a baseball cap pulled down low and a pair of dark sunglasses, enough to obscure his features from a casual glance. He walked into the bustling terminal, and positioned himself near a bank of payphones in the main corridor, a perfect vantage point with a clear view of the arrival gates. He picked up the receiver of one of the phones. On the other end of the line was his best friend, a man who knew what Gary was planning and was desperately trying to talk him out of it. "Don't do it, Gary," his friend pleaded. "It's not worth it. Think about your other kids. Think about Jody." But Gary's responses were clipped, his voice a low monotone. His mind was made up. He was there to listen, but not to be persuaded. Coincidentally, a local news crew from the WBRZ TV station was also at the airport. They had been tipped off that the high-profile suspect, Jeff Doucette, was arriving and were there to capture the perp walk for the evening news. The cameraman set up his bulky video camera, its light casting a bright, artificial glare on the scene. He had no idea he was about to film one of the most raw and shocking moments in the history of televised news. Around 9:30 p.m., Doucette appeared. Flanked by several uniformed police officers, he was led through the terminal. He was uncuffed, a decision that would later be heavily scrutinized. He walked with a slight swagger, a smirk playing on his lips. As the procession made its way down the corridor, they passed directly in front of the payphone where Gary Plauché stood, pretending to be deep in conversation. Not as Doucette drew level with him, Gary moved. It was a single, fluid motion. He let the phone receiver drop, its cord swinging freely. He stepped out from behind the payphone booth. He pulled the .38 revolver from his waistband. The news camera, which had been focused on Doucette, instinctively swiveled to capture the new movement. Time seemed to slow down. Gary raised the gun, his arm steady, and aimed it at the side of Doucette's head. He was only a few feet away. He fired. A single shot. The sound of the gunshot was a deafening explosion that ripped through the mundane chatter of the airport. Jeff Doucette's head snapped to the side. The smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. He crumpled to the linoleum floor, a pool of blood instantly forming around his head. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered. The police officers, caught completely by surprise, lunged at Gary, tackling him to the ground with overwhelming force. The WBRZ cameraman, running on pure instinct, kept filming, capturing the raw, terrifying aftermath. As officers pinned a completely passive Gary to the floor, one of them, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and anguish, yelled the question that would become the title of a book and the defining phrase of the entire saga. "Gary, why? Why, Gary?" Gary offered no resistance. He had done what he came to do. His mission was over. The entire, shocking event, from the moment he stepped out to the moment he was pinned to the ground, was captured on a single, continuous take on a grainy Betacam tape. Jeff Doucette was rushed to the hospital, but the single bullet had done catastrophic damage. He fell into a coma and died the following day. And Gary Plauché, the quiet, ordinary father, was led away in handcuffs, his act of brutal, public vengeance forever immortalized on video for the entire world to see. The arrest of Gary Plauché was immediate, but the legal and social fallout was just beginning. The raw, unedited footage captured by the WBRZ news crew was broadcast almost instantly, first locally, then nationally, and eventually globally. It became one of the first truly viral videos of real-life violence, a horrifying spectacle that people could watch and re-watch from the safety of their living rooms. The public saw it all, the tense wait, the sudden, brutal act, and the anguished cry of the arresting officer. This unprecedented visibility transformed Gary Plauché's case from a local crime story into a national referendum on justice, fatherhood, and revenge. Initially, the state of Louisiana charged Gary with second-degree murder, a crime that carried a potential sentence of life in prison. On paper, the case was a prosecutor's dream, a premeditated killing, committed in public, with dozens of witnesses and captured in its entirety on video. A conviction seemed all but certain. However, the legal system quickly ran into a powerful, unassailable force, overwhelming public opinion. From the moment the story broke, Gary Plauché was not seen by a vast majority of the public as a murderer. He was seen as a hero, a father who had done what any loving parent would wish they had the courage to do. Letters of support poured into the jail. People sent money for his legal defense. Talk shows and newspaper columns were dominated by a debate where sympathy for Gary far outweighed condemnation. He became a folk hero, an embodiment of righteous fury against a system that seemed to whom protect predators more than it did their victims. This immense public pressure had a profound effect on the legal proceedings. Gary's defense team built their case around his mental state. They never disputed that he had pulled the trigger. Instead, they argued that he was not legally responsible for his actions due to a state of temporary insanity. They brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Edward P. Uzi, who testified that learning the graphic details of the abuse his son had endured had caused Gary to suffer a psychotic break. Dr. Uzi argued that at the moment of the shooting, Gary was operating in a dissociative state, unable to distinguish between right and wrong. His act, the defense claimed, was not the product of a criminal mind, but of a paternal mind shattered by unbearable trauma. Faced with an airtight case on the facts, but an unwinnable case in the court of public opinion, the prosecution agreed to a plea bargain. Gary Plauché pleaded no contest to the lesser charge of manslaughter. The sentencing hearing fell to Judge Frank Saya, who was now tasked with balancing the letter of the law against the palpable will of the community. In a decision that became as famous as the crime itself, Judge Saya handed down a remarkably lenient sentence. A 7-year suspended prison sentence, 5 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service. Gary Plauché would not spend a single day in jail for killing Jeff Doucette in his ruling. Judge Saya articulated the sentiment that many felt, stating that sending Gary to prison would serve no useful purpose for Mr. Plauché, or for his family, or for society. He concluded that Gary was not a danger to the public and was highly unlikely to reoffend. The verdict was met with applause in the courtroom and widespread approval across the nation. Justice, it seemed, had bent to the will of a father's rage. And the public's empathy. In the years that followed, Gary Plauché lived a quiet life, forever defined by that single, violent act at the airport. In a rare interview given when he was 67, he was asked if he had any regrets. His answer was unwavering. No, I don't feel any remorse for what I did. I'm just sorry for the pain it caused my family. He maintained that if he had to do it all over again, he would. His son, Jody, embarked on his own long and painful journey of healing. He eventually found the strength to speak out, becoming an advocate for survivors of child sexual abuse. In August 2019, he told his side of the story. In a book titled, Why, Gary, Why? The Jody Plauché Story, a direct reference to the haunting question asked by the arresting officer. The book detailed not only the abuse, but also the complex love he felt for the father, who had both saved him and committed a public killing. In his name, Gary Plauché's health declined in his later years. A stroke in 2011 left him physically impaired, a challenge for a man who had always worked with his hands. But the internal storms he weathered had been far more taxing. In 2014, just 3 weeks shy of his 69th birthday, he suffered a second stroke and passed away in a nursing home. His story remains a powerful and unsettling chapter in American crime history. It is more than just the tale of a vigilante father. It is a reflection on the complex, often blurry lines between justice, anger, mercy, and humanity. Was Gary Plauché a hero, or a man who defied the law? Does a person ever have the right to enact their own justice? The story of Gary Plauché is filled with questions that have no easy answers. But one thing is certain: the mark he left, born of a father's pain and captured forever on a grainy videotape, will not be forgotten.